Well, I speak to you as someone whose content is blocked on Facebook, so I'm used to social media censorship.
Why was your content blocked on Facebook, Bob?
They have offered various explanations. Originally, they thought I was a spammer. They then started sending out when I would have subscribers that would want to put it on Facebook.
Into that.
Just don't look for it on Facebook.
Don't look for it on Facebook, right? And you may not be able to see this one on YouTube by the time we're done, but nonetheless, if you go to Substack, you can find Bob's article on this. This is Paul Johnson with the New Frontiers. Today, you're going to see the familiar faces of Professor Henry Thompson, as well as columnist Bob Robb, as we talk about a wide variety of issues that are going on in the United States. We start with a discussion about what is taking place in Ukraine, as well as American values and why they are worthy of defending. We then move to TikTok and get into the debate between this whole idea of free speech versus trying to make certain that we're protecting American interests. And finally, we end up talking about the federal budget. Now, there are a whole list of issues that you're going to see us talk about today, but the one constant theme that we hope always goes through this is for you to recognize that we're just ordinary people who still have an optimistic view of America and who believe that the United States is still a cause for good. If you agree with us, if you like these concepts or topics, go ahead and push that subscribe button and let's get going.
Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon and disticate and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Well, I'd like to welcome my guest back to New Frontiers. We have Bob Robb, the columnist. Bob, welcome back today.
Always good to be with you.
And Professor Henry Thompson. Professor, thanks for being with us today again on New Frontiers.
Good to see you, Paul and Bob.
Just this week, we spent, actually last week, all three of us were on a panel focused on what was taking place in Israel. And we spent a lot of time talking about the variety of issues that were going on in the Middle East, including the positions of the U.S. talking to a United States ambassador. We had a historian on who spoke about what really Israel was all about. We had a great speaker at the end who came from the Washington Institute who spoke about how to get to peace. And then we also had this film that we watched, the IDF film, which has only been seen by a select group of people, which is fairly horrendous. The thing that struck out to me was that we spent a lot of time talking about the values that oftentimes that we're opposed to as Americans, these concepts that have come from decolonization, postmodernism, critical race theory, the idea that there's always an oppressed versus an oppressor. But it seems to me one of the things that we've oftentimes avoided is talking about the values that we care about in the U.S. and not only where those values are oftentimes under attack, but who it is that's out there supporting them and what it is that we believe is worth saving. Bob, I know that you've written a lot about this on the American World Order. So if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you. And as we go through the show, we're going to hit on some other topics, including TikTok and the budget. You wrote a great concept about the VAT tax. But I'd like to start just with the values that you think are worth defending in the U.S.
I tend to agree mostly with Joe Biden's characterization that the geopolitical challenge of our time is the competition between what I would call democratic capitalism. I don't think Biden would use that phraseology, and authoritarianism, and the values that make this country different and largely transformed the post-World War II world are democratic governance, free market economics, and a suite of human rights that vest in the individual, not the collective. And I think that we have an interest in helping other countries adopt those values and defend them against threats. I tend to be kind of circumspect about what we can effectively do to achieve that. But I believe there's places where they are most definitely under attack and at risk. And I think Ukraine and Israel are two places that warrant an appropriate level of U.S. involvement to help people who share those values be able to continue to live under them.
Yeah, it seems to me one of the things that sticks out to me in this American world order that we talk about. We like to talk about authoritarianism, but it seems to me one of the truths that exists in all structures, whether they be governmental structures or, for that matter, political structures, corporate structures, there always is, over time, a tendency for the organization itself to corrupt. That you may start off with ideals that are good ideals, but over time, those organizations and structures tend to come across pressures that force them or cause them to become corruptible. One of the things that exists in the United States that I think is helpful is this whole balance of power concept. I think we sometimes overlook how important a role that plays in our organization becoming less corrupt. And it's not just the balance of power that exists between the executive office and the executive and legislative versus the judicial, but it's also the balance of power between government and the private sector. We've put a tremendous amount of power into the hands of not only the individual, but the private sector itself. And that's created corporate structures that oftentimes, when we look at our leadership, our leadership's not one person like Xi or Putin. It becomes people like Elon Musk or Warren Buffett or any one of a number of other people who equally become our heroes because we have this balance on both sides. Henry, I'd love your thought on this.
Yeah, I agree mostly with Bob and with you on this broad concept about the American institutions, liberal democracy, etc. But I do think we have to be realistic about what the United States can achieve through only working with like-minded powers. I mean, this democracy versus autocracy binary division, I think, is a little too simple. It helps us in some cases, but not in others. For example, Vietnam has become a really major ally of the United States, trading partner since the US is trying to decouple from China. And also it's a major regional rival to China. And yet it's a communist dictatorship the same as China, right? So in some cases, Western democracies are going to have to make allies with states that are not democracies, that are autocracies, but share similar interests. And so I think that's one important point, is that we're going to have alliances of convenience, whether it's with a communist dictatorship like Vietnam or a authoritarian monarchy like Saudi Arabia. And of course, we can do those things in the pursuit of democratization in other countries and pushing back against the most powerful authoritarian powers. But it's worth being realistic about the fact that this democracy versus autocracy divide is not a clean divide and doesn't really accurately capture what's going on in world politics. And the other thing I'd say is that sometimes even big autocracies have to be dealt with in a pragmatic way, the way that Nixon and Kissinger had to go to China to basically make China an ally of the United States against the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was a greater threat to security for the United States and in Europe, etc. And it could be that we are faced with a similar sort of a scenario in Ukraine for too long, if the Russians continue to make advances in the east of Ukraine and it becomes apparent that the Ukrainians can't win the war and maybe not even hold significant amounts of their own territory, the United States might have to deal with Russia, even despite it not changing its system of government, if Putin remains in place. So I think that the overarching, maybe sort of world historical goal of opposing autocracy, promoting liberal values and liberal democracy is definitely the goal, but sometimes there have to be phases where US and other liberal powers have to deal with some pretty distasteful allies to get towards that goal.
Yeah, if you look at Ukraine, the issue is we obviously were hoping the best for them to be able to have success in taking back territory, but they weren't successful at that. It seems to me that we're heading towards an armistice when it comes to Ukraine, that's probably going to be our best outcome, which means that we're in a position with Russia where maybe we don't recognize the border. Maybe the border just doesn't get recognized, but instead we start allowing Ukraine to play a deeper role in the American world order or the rules-based order, that they begin to be able to do more trade with other partners. But it seems to me that sometimes we play this game in a way in which we allow them to set the playing field. As an example, with Russia, the answer is they can come in and undermine the American world order anytime they want. We saw that in the 2016 campaign. And I'm not talking about whether or not Donald Trump was involved with it. That seemed to be somewhat overextended, if you ask me. But what wasn't overextended was that there was a real Russian attempt to try to create divisions inside the United States, and they had an organization to do it. And yet we're so terrified of regime change that we won't even talk about that. That clearly is the single biggest thing inside an authoritarian government, is the fear of being overthrown. Now, from our standpoint, I doubt seriously we're going to find a group of people there that we could support that are going to support democratic values. But there are other authoritarians there that we can begin to put pressure on them, saying, if this is the way that you're going to continue to play, maybe we're going to push back in an equal way. Bob, your thoughts?
I would make a distinction with respect to both what Henry and you articulated. Seeing the overarching paradigm as being between democratic capitalism and authoritarianism doesn't dictate not having relationships with those that fall outside that orbit. It's just keeping an eye on what the ultimate objective is in terms of preserving our place and our ability to run our affairs the way that we want. And I think we should be very cautious about the extent to which we make any security reliance, as opposed to having economic relations with authoritarian powers. The notion that the Saudi Arabia is an ally of the United States, I don't think is borne out by history. They support us to the extent we're willing to engage in their fights on their behalf. And I would feel the same way about Vietnam. Trade with Vietnam doesn't pose the same security risks that trade with China does. And I wouldn't cut off the U.S. economy and economic relationships on the basis of forms of governmental organization, with the exception of China. It's big enough that its involvement in our economy is per se a security threat. And I think that it is an exception to the general rule of free trade. I also am reluctant, while I believe that we should support our allies in ways that are in our self-interest, in preserving their own freedom of action under the principles of democratic capitalism. I'm reluctant about thinking that we can put effective pressure on authoritarian governments to reform. Our track record with respect to that has not been good. And I think that it requires an internal development. You see peaceful transformations when authoritarian governments who have created export-oriented economies transform into being more of a consumer-oriented economy. And the principles of democratic capitalism tend to go along with that. You saw that in South Korea, you saw that in Taiwan. So I would be hesitant to think we're going to be very effective in putting pressure on reform as opposed to it occurring internally. And I don't think we cut off relations with people who fall outside the democratic capitalist orbit, I think we should be very cautious about relying upon them with respect to security interests.
All right, so that begs this question. We're talking today about doing things that oftentimes strike at some of our core values. This whole concept of, do we ban TikTok versus the rights of free speech? And so the question that raises for me is, do we allow illiberal orders to be able to utilize the liberal world order as a means to undermine itself? What we know about China with TikTok is that through ByteDance, they have a company that has an active involvement inside of TikTok, that they're utilizing that as a means to be able to, that they can utilize that as a means to be able to extract data and to create divisions in the U.S. In fact, I would argue a lot of what we've seen on Israel is coming from the 40% of the people who are watching TikTok on a regular basis, and they're being fed information through an algorithm that is designed to create a division inside the United States. Now, just as my own experiment, I had kind of a interesting deal here. I had put up a post that was one of the 1-minute posts that we put up on all the other social medias, and it was a criticism of Xi and what he was doing and some of the comments that he had made in a speech. I utilized an article behind it that just was a standard article with a headline that named who the newspaper was that where the headline had come from, and it started to get traction. TikTok immediately took it down and sent me a suspension notice. So I thought, that's interesting. And they said I violated their standards. So I did another one, and it happened again. So then I decided, you know what? I'm going to take the same article and I'm going to put it up with Joe Biden on it. And I'm going to also put it up with Donald Trump on it and put a criticism of them. In both cases, they left them up. Now, it didn't get as much traction, but in both cases, they left them up. It's very clear to me. We've now tested this over a dozen times, and I challenge the audience to do it. Give a big criticism of Xi and watch what happens on TikTok. The algorithm stops you. We know that the algorithm that they utilize inside the United States is not the same algorithm that they use at home. And we also know that Facebook isn't able to do the same thing in China that TikTok is allowed to do here. Now, the flip side of this is, are we going to regulate free speech in a way in which that says to China, hey, you can't, or to TikTok, you can't have an algorithm here. You can't have a company here that has an active involvement with the Chinese Communist Party. Henry, I'll start with you on this one.
That's super interesting, Paul. Thanks for telling that story. It's really interesting to hear your experiences with these different platforms and the different messages. I think you're getting at a big question, really. You know, some people, like the J.D. Vances of the world, would say that international trade is a liberal tool of the liberal world order that China has used against the United States to, crush American workers, to eliminate their jobs, right, by undercutting American manufacturers. I don't actually agree with that. I think that goes too far. I think that there is a point at which these sorts of platforms are a national security risk, right? So you can have international trade in deck chairs. It might put a deck chair company in Phoenix here out of business, but it's not a threat to the United States national security interests. But if you have international trade in some sort of parts for jet engines that are only used in military aircraft, or some sort of parts of bombs or something, or weapons, then that could potentially be a sort of trade that you don't want to have with China because it's a threat to national security interests. And so I would say the same thing about these social media companies. But I think that the threat to national interests can come from kind of interesting sources. So you just mentioned something about they could sow division, right? So systematically they could promote certain messages over others, or maybe a kind of a balance of different messages that are antagonistic towards one another. That's possible. And then in a more critical situation, in a sort of a crisis, these platforms could also be used to sow disinformation. Like, for example, in the city of Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, as we're speaking, Putin's troll farms are putting out messages and putting up fake websites and things telling the citizens of Kharkiv that the city has been encircled, that the outskirts of Kharkiv are being shelled, and that they should flee, right? In order to get the civilian population to leave the city, to create chaos there, to make it easier for the Russian armed forces that are slowly advancing on that city. And imagine if there was some sort of domestic crisis in the United States, or heaven forbid there was some sort of war between the United States and China. These sorts of platforms could be used in very similar ways to create total chaos. So I think that maybe in the case of social media, you have to have a fairly wide remit in terms of what is allowed and what isn't. And for national security concerns, maybe you do have to onshore some of the capabilities of these firms to make sure that they are not under the control of hostile governments.
Bob, I'd love your thought on this. And I'm going to add a comment. What was fascinating to me politically was that this ban was a ban that was proposed by Donald Trump during the period of time that he was in office. And of course, now he has this large contributor who's a supporter of TikTok in the US. I don't know if that's the connection point or not, but whatever it is, he's become opposed to it. Watching the politics of this, I've noticed that there are a number of people on the right who have now moved to the point of being the defender of TikTok being able to stay in play. I'd love to know not only your thought on TikTok, but what's happening politically on this issue. To me, it's fascinating to watch this change that is taking place.
Well, I speak to you as someone whose content is blocked on Facebook, so I'm used to social media censorship.
Why was your content blocked on Facebook, Bob?
They have offered various explanations. Originally, they thought I was a spammer. They then started sending out, when I would have subscribers that would want to put it on Facebook, they would get messages saying that someone had complained about the content, which was impossible because the content hadn't been up very long before someone tried to put it on and was blocked. I have, at various points in time, checked a little mark saying that I disagree with their decision. I've never heard back from Facebook. And frankly, on the right, it kind of gave me some street cred to be banned. So I haven't been very anxious to try to.
Is it specifically your Substack posts that are people can't share them on
Facebook?
Facebook?
Republic columns, but then
even the Republic columns
continued with Substack.
That's crazy.
But I don't think TikTok is appropriately regarded as a free speech issue. It is a question of the openness of our capital markets and our markets to foreign entities. In general, I'm in favor of being very liberal. I'm in favor of free trade. But once again, I think China is an exception. I don't think time is on China's benefit. I believe that they've got some long-term challenges that will reduce their threat to the United States. But at present, simply because of their size, they pose a unique challenge. And I think we need to close off our markets to them to the maximum extent possible, and certainly not permit Chinese ownership of a social media outlet, which has hundreds of Americans participating on it regularly, skewing towards younger Americans. I think that would be a serious mistake. And so I think it was appropriate for Congress to pass a bill not banning TikTok or anything that's said on TikTok, but saying that it can't be owned by a Chinese company, that its ownership needs to be transferred. I was encouraged that you saw incredible bipartisan support for that. But Paul, you're absolutely right that on the right, there's been a change in perspective as the right in this country has become more populist and nationalistic. There's a tendency in some parts of the right, particularly the MAGA right, to look more favorably at some authoritarian regimes, and to treat Hungary as a model of all things, and to parrot some of uh, Putin's slanders against Ukraine and the Ukrainian leadership. So that is definitely a factor. I was encouraged that it didn't seem to affect the vote with respect to TikTok very much.
Yeah, I look at this. I'm an independent, and I don't know if I lean right or lean left. I think it depends upon the issue. There are some issues I lean right on, and some that I lean left on. I think the concepts that we're talking about are under attack on both the right and the left, as we just kind of spoke about here a moment ago. On the right, it's being attacked today by a group of people who somehow or another are beginning to think that authoritarianism is okay. And that, to me, I am lost by the right thinking that to me, they've always been the vanguard, the sentinel against those types of sentiments in the United States. But you spoke about what happened to you on Facebook. I had an experience on YouTube, and my experience on YouTube was I had a conversation with an individual named Brandon Tatum. He's a very sharp fellow. He's been able to get tons of different posts, but he was a police officer at one point, I think in Tucson. Also was a football player, a college football player, and he has a very good audience. But what we began to talk about was the idea of were our police departments filled with racism in the United States? And I gave my experience. And if you go back and look at it, it's now back up. It wasn't bombastic in any way. I just simply said, in my experience, it wasn't racism that was driving the problems of our police department. That doesn't mean that there weren't problems, but I thought that oftentimes racism was being used so much that it was stopping us from figuring out the real problem. As an example, we all know about, the older generation would remember the movie Serpico, where Serpico was this agent who worked for a police department in New York, and he figured out that the police department was being corrupt, and they ended up setting him up in a drug bust where he got shot. Well, that began to change all the police departments in the United States, where they began to say, look, we're not going to let anybody stay in an area for more than 6 months, and we moved them around. Well, the problem with that was you're sending in constantly a new group of police officers that the neighborhood doesn't know, and that the police officer doesn't know the neighborhood, and they become more terrified of one another. What we found is that the more time that we could spend having those people communicate and talk and have a relationship, the better we were at actually fighting crime. We figured that out because we got this grant to be able to go out and work inside a neighborhood. We saw dramatic results from it. But they were blaming racism on this area where you ended up having, in one particular case, they had a black police officer who ended up beating up another black individual. And in the very beginning, they tried to claim that it was racism. And then when they figured out it was black officers, they talked about it being systematic racism. Anyway, I hope I don't get banned now on this show. But nonetheless, the point was that they took it off. And the reason for it was, in my opinion, because there is a ideology that has begun to become formed on a number of our social platforms on the left who want an orthodoxy. They don't really want a conversation. I don't know how to fix these problems that we have in the United States without a conversation. And I like the idea that we have a conversation on the left and a conversation on the right, and that we can try to figure out what's working and what's not working. But we have these two groups that have begun to form in our society that to me are as anti-free speech as you can get. But the idea that you would allow the Communist Party of China to be able to have a dominant role in getting information, which, by the way, now is 40% of American phones, 40% of American phones have TikTok on it, that we would allow them to be able to have that information to disrupt the United States, to put us in a position where they're utilizing their algorithm to drive divisions between us, that seems to me to be nuts. Professor.
I'm not on social media at all. I feel embarrassed that as your junior of a couple of decades, Bob and Paul, that you know more about what's going on these social media platforms than I do. But I
the old guy knows.
I've never been censored on Facebook or Twitter because I've never actually had Facebook or Twitter accounts for very long. What I will say is that people need to be able to discuss their political opinions openly. A couple of semesters ago here at ASU, I started this class. It's called Talking Across Political Differences. It was offered as a special topics class. It was the first time it had ever been offered. And all it was every week I would sort of prompt the students with a provocative news story, often something about ASU, like, for example, whether the Wisconsin shooter Kyle Rittenhouse should have been allowed to enroll in ASU was one of the topics that we had. They had this multicultural space scandal on ASU campus where they had a sort of a room in the student union that was only for minority students to use, and that blew up into a national scandal. There was a New York Times report on it. So I would just present these topics to the students, and then they would discuss in small groups, and then we would come back to the larger group to talk about everyone's group discussions. And my reaction to or expectation teaching the class was actually really worried that this would escalate, right? Which is, I think, kind of what maybe the social media companies are doing. They're suppressing certain opinions because they're worried that things will get too escalatory, etc. And maybe they do online to a greater degree than in person. But my students, they had opinions all over the map, completely divergent opinions on all these different issues. Some of them got pretty heated. Many of them actually, they didn't really get very heated, the discussions. But when they did, they were able to talk about these things, even when they had wildly divergent. So I think that class went well. I got really good reviews. I'm going to hopefully teach it again in the spring. But I came away from it really thinking that maybe that there's a lot of vitriol going on online that doesn't happen when people are talking face to face, and that actually having these conversations is really important, especially for young people like political science students who want to discuss political issues, and that we can actually have these discussions without things breaking out into a, cussing or name calling or something.
So, Henry, you brought up at the conference on the Middle East, we talked about with you what was going on college campuses. So I just went to, my son graduated from the business school at Columbia. So I ended up going back this last weekend and had a chance to talk to a pretty diverse group of people and some of the people who were on the protester side in Columbia. One of the things that was fascinating is that during that conversation, one of the young people said to me, we were kind of going back and forth on differing ideas. Certainly, I'm a big supporter of Israel because I think Israel not only represents our values, I think they came under attack on October the 7th, and they certainly have the right to defend themselves. But nonetheless, as I was kind of going through that, he said, well, you have a very American point of view. Again, this was an American student, so I was kind of taken back by that. I said, oh, well, so what view do you have? And he said, well, what do you mean? He said, I have an unbiased view. And I said, first, in the Middle East, there is no such a thing as an unbiased view. If you think you have an unbiased view, you need psychotherapy. You are way off because we all have some bias in it. But it was clear as he began to present his view was one that fundamentally believed that Western values were actually corrupt values, that that we were an oppressor, that we were a colonializer. Of course, I tried to explain to him. I said, okay, so let's talk about the Middle East for a moment. When you look at Israel, there are no more indigenous of people than the Israelis, than the Jews, right? It's probably true. So are Arabs. Arabs and Jews both came from Abraham. How can you be more indigenous than that? How is it that you have this white colonializer that you put Israel into the position of? But what I'm really interested more in is what's happening philosophically at our colleges that is driving this. Is this being driven in your mind more by what's being taught, or is it being driven by a lack of civics, a lack of understanding of how Western values stack up to that, or is it being driven by something on the outside?
Honestly, probably a combination, right? I think that you mentioned the news feeds coming from TikTok and other video-heavy sites that are presenting super emotive images of people getting killed in Gaza and these sorts of things. Huge human suffering. I think that's having a big emotional impact on students. There is definitely a group of faculty you can find on any college campus that's going to teach this kind of neo-Marxist, whether it's post-colonial theory, postmodern theory that revolves around biases of power that drive everything, that lead to this sort of thinking, as we've talked about many times, about the oppressor versus the oppressed, and those being sort of irreparably antagonistic groups. You can always find a group of faculty teaching those sorts of ideas, but the question is whether students self-select into those majors, which I'm not sure that they are. I think most students are concentrated on getting a different type of training to get themselves a job when they graduate, right? So I think that it's a combination of things, and oftentimes you see in the reports about these protests, including the one at ASU, I read a statistic that it was either 60 or 80% of the people who were involved in the encampment, pro-Palestine encampment, weren't even ASU students. And so I think you see this confluence of outside activists, some sort of a hardcore of campus community that are really mobilized around these ideas, and then maybe a lot of students who are broadly sympathizing because of what they're seeing on social media and other news outlets. So I think it's really a combination of factors that are going on to lead to these protests. But the final thing I'll say is that I think if you add up the total number of people protesting that are motivated about these issues, it's really, really small compared to even the total campus population, let alone the total population of Phoenix or Tucson or whatever college town you want to take. So I think there's a lot going on, but we're still talking about a relatively small group of activists on campus.
By the way, that in my opinion, in watching Columbia, there is truth to that. The media has a goal to try to make it larger than it is because it strikes fear in people and makes you want to watch tomorrow. Now, the question I would ask you before I go back to Bob is, you are definitely a proponent of Western values, maybe not American values, but Western values as they relate to American values. And I've listened to you enough to know that you are a big advocate of it. Is that something that you would be challenged on in liberal colleges in the United States? And have you met good receptivity at ASU in terms of teaching or focusing on those ideals?
That's a good question. I'm really in the mainstream of my discipline of political science and political economy. My research is not really contentious, and most of it leads in the same direction, right? Democracy is good, capitalism is good, property rights are good, these set incentives for peaceful development, all these sorts of things are not really contested in serious social scientific circles. So I think that a lot of these debates are happening in parallel among completely different groups of intellectuals, if you understand what I mean. If you go to, I just wouldn't appear on a panel or wouldn't present to a group of scholars that so fundamentally differed from me on these sorts of questions. And so it's unlikely that I would be exposed to these sorts of radical challenges from a neo-Marxist or a post-colonial theorist or something like that, because we just wouldn't be in the same room, to be perfectly frank. We're not reading the same journals. We're not, these are completely separate groups of people. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's a problem. That's kind of a big question that I don't really know how to answer. But I really do think that these are kind of separate groups of people in different departments of the universities, going to different conferences, members of different associations that are following completely different paradigms that go in completely different directions in terms of their assessment of Western history, world history, the direction for the future, all that sort of stuff.
There is a ideology that has become pervasive in the universities and has infected many of our large corporations and other institutions, which can be called identity and grievance politics. It goes by the popular name of wokeism. And this ideology doesn't fail to address traditional Western values. It says that those values are a snare and a delusion, that they are propagated to hold up the power and undergird paternalism and white supremacy. So it goes beyond simply neglecting our core values represented by the Declaration of Independence, probably most formally, to undermining it, trashing it, and also saying that we need to deal with people based upon their group identity, not their individual merit. And this is a ideology that pervades higher education, and as I said, has begun to infect large corporations. I believe that we're beginning to see a kickback, and that the peak power that ideology has held is beginning to recede. I don't know how far it will go in terms of receding, but I believe that we have at least arrested its continuing pernicious influence.
You know, a guest on our show was Professor Steven Pinker from Harvard, who I've watched him for a while and known him for a while. He definitely is a very liberal professor. You wouldn't count him as being conservative by any stretch of the imagination. His comment about Harvard University and other universities is that it's mainly propagated through DEI. That DEI has evolved into something that goes way beyond just a theory of how we can all work together and operate together. It's become an ideology that has become very large bureaucratic institutions inside of many universities, and that he talks about his opposition to the DEI dogma is that part of what they ask people to sign as a pledge focuses on the idea that some groups of people are above other groups of people, and that needs to happen to try to equalize out the playing field. Now, he's written a number of books. One of my favorites that he's written is called The Enlightenment Now. In Enlightenment Now, he talks about the idea of what's happened with democratic capitalism. He's not necessarily wet to in terms of the ideology. He's wet to it in terms of the data. He says all the data says this has produced more value to mankind than any other ideology that's out there. The idea that we see people as individuals has done a tremendous amount to move our country forward. But he says what is happening, and he's a big member of FIRE, which, by the way, ASU ends up being one of the best rated schools in the country with a FIRE rating, meaning they support free speech. He said is not true in campuses like Harvard, where you are either going to be a member of DEI or you're not going to be involved with it, which means also that begins to propagate which type of professors are going to become a part of it. And so conservative professors, of which he's not, all of a sudden don't get a role inside the university. And he said, and that begins to have an effect on not only what's being taught, but what PhDs are being supported. To me, that is an interesting, what I hadn't thought about was the bureaucratic aspects of DEI. I'm not a supporter of it. I tend to like what I call the Meade process, which is merit, equality, agency, and diversity. There's no doubt diversity we are helped by, but I want my employees first and foremost to know that they were hired from a meritorious standpoint. They were hired because they were the best person for the job. Now, we put, because we have a call center attached to it, a big focus on empathy, and that has given us a disproportionate amount of minorities in our firm. I don't know exactly why that's happened, but I know that that's what the result of it has been. But they were hired because of merit first. Everyone got an equal chance. That's important. I want them to have agency. And you can't have agency if you believe that you were brought on simply because of some quota, as opposed to you had merit to be there. But the last thing is diversity. And diversity, that's not important from our employee standpoint. That's important from our standpoint because we have to speak to a large amount of people, women, Hispanics, African Americans, Asians, as well as Anglos. And so that diversity ends up giving us something that's helpful to our company. But what I hadn't thought about again was that oftentimes these concepts like DEI, it's not just the concept, it becomes the agency that comes behind it, the bureaucracy. And then, at least in listening to him, he says at Harvard University that has resulted in hundreds of people whose job it is to enforce this orthodoxy onto the faculty. Bob, I'll let you comment on that.
I think Pinker is a good example of why I think that wokeness has hit the peak. He has organized a group in Harvard to try to contest it and try to reorient Harvard back to classical liberal academic standards and qualifications and discussions. And I think you see that increasingly on campuses across the country. I think the DEI bureaucracy is still firmly in charge in most of these institutions, but they now are being challenged, and I'm hopeful that we've reached the peak, and we're going to see that recede, and we return to the notion that individual merit is the thing that matters the most, and that universities should be a place of free inquiry and pursuing empirical data and information.
Yeah, it's almost like Dracula, right? You pull open those drapes, and it's amazing what happens to people who work in bureaucracies that think that nobody was watching them before. And that's what free speech does. It just rips open those drapes and puts light onto it. But Henry, you're definitely more in the middle of this than we are. So I'm going to give you last comment on this.
Absolutely, the best way of analyzing universities is as unaccountable bureaucracies. And they are large bureaucracies. They have often have monopolies, right, over higher education. ASU is, I think there are 2 universities in the entire Phoenix metro area, like 5 million people here. So you've got a monopoly over a product. You've got a very large, relatively unaccountable bureaucracy. And when you see the bureaucratic structures start to promote something, then that's what the institution is going to be directed towards. It's not, the university is not here in a sort of a free marketplace of ideas among the faculty and who's got the best research or who's got the best philosophy or something. This is a big bureaucracy. That's how things work. And I would just say something which is kind of related to my point before about the protest, which is that what proportion of the Arizona population has a college degree? 25, 30%? Bob and I had lunch the other day. We fought over this. I said, I think that what goes on in these elite college campuses isn't that important, because, it's only a small elite concern. Not that many people go to university. And Bob didn't agree with me for various reasons. And as always, he was probably right. But if we're going to grow the number of people that go to our big state universities, they have to be welcoming to everyone, right? They can't be elitist, and they can't be distracted by bureaucratic incentives that lead away from their core, especially the public universities' core mission of educating the population and helping to grow a stable, thriving local economy, right? And so the worry is that these are sort of elite concerns among these small groups of bureaucrats at the public universities, but they have a much broader impact, whether it's because they have an impact on the ideology of corporations and other places, which is what Bob thinks, or simply because it leads the university to take its eye off the ball. And instead of enrolling more working class kids into bachelor's degrees that allow them to get a higher paying job and allow the local economy to grow, they end up devoting a lot of resources to things that don't end up pursuing their core goals. So we have to be careful about our universities. Even though they only 25 or 30% of the population ever have any contact to them whatsoever, we probably want that number to go up. They're pretty unaccountable bureaucracies. We've seen this time and time again, that there's not real strong mechanisms of control over these institutions, and they can kind of go down rabbit holes that aren't conducive to the common good.
All right. So I want to flip to our last subject today, and it's the budget deficit. Bob, you've written a great article about that, and I want to start by focusing on that. It seems to me that these values, again, going back to Steven Pinker, I loved the idea that he talked about how these values have resulted in something that's very special. We've created the greatest superpower in the history of the planet, and I believe that it has fundamentally come from those ideas. You'll hear different people making arguments. I love Peter Zion. He also has been on the show. He has a great argument about we are basically a geographical accident. The idea that we had such security from the Pacific and the Atlantic and all these great riverways resulted in this accidental superpower. Then you can listen to The folks who've written the two authors, which slipped my mind, although Professor Robinson was on our show,
Acemoglu and
who wrote the
Robinson.
book
Yeah.
Why Nations Fail. In Why Nations Fail, he talks about the concept of extracting. When you extract things from people, either through government or through monopolies, that has a damaging effect on people's ability to be able to grow and to innovate. But it seems to me that the single greatest thing that we have kind of comes from the very beginning, which was our Constitution and the idea that we have these individual rights that include property rights and free markets and other things. But regardless, I also think there's a huge risk. And the huge risk that we have in a democratic system is overspending. It becomes much more difficult when you have to go back to the public and convince them to vote for you, not to give them the things that they want. And you wrote an article about this march that we're onto for this European type of capitalism. And you talked about the eventual evolution of the VAT tax. By the way, that article is on Substack, and I recommend anybody who is interested in this topic to go read this article. It definitely is a great piece. But Bob, if you would, give us kind of your insights into that.
Just don't look for it on Facebook.
Don't look for it on Facebook, right? And you may not be able to see this one on YouTube by the time we're done, but nonetheless, if you go to Substack, you can find Bob's article on this. So, Bob, give us your insights onto this.
Well, it appears to me that the cumulative federal debt and annual deficits is gaining some salience as a political issue, and that the markets are beginning to push back against the idea of lending the federal government unlimited sums of money at very low interest rates. The interest rate on the federal debt has gone up. Participation in the auctions to place the debt is declining. And I think that we're not going to be able to avoid it politically the way both parties have tried to do too much longer. I think we've got some period of time before it becomes impossible to ignore, but I think we're headed towards the place where the politicians have to deal with it. And the primary purpose of the column was to demonstrate the fiction that we can support the level of spending that Democrats want in turning the American political economy into a European-style social democracy, strictly by taxing the rich and corporations. And it just happened that Biden's proposed budget for next fiscal year, which begins in October, provided a very, very good illustration of that, because it proposes a whole suite of those kind of tax increases. Increases in the corporate income tax rate, increases in the top individual tax rate, increases in capital gains taxes for the affluent, taxing the unrealized capital gains of the super rich. It's kind of hard to imagine that you could go beyond what he has proposed. But even with all those enacted, and with his own favorable economic assumptions as to how his budget will play out in the economy, you still have chronic deficits of $1.6 trillion a year on average for the next 10 years. So the budget itself sort of illustrated that that's a fiction. And if we are going to have to deal with this issue, we need to get beyond the fiction and get into some real potential solutions. And it has long been my observation that I thought the Democrats were backing us into a value-added tax. Our current rates of taxation on corporations and the rich are pretty much at the European level. We aren't below the Europeans in terms of the way that we tax capital and the way that we tax income. The Europeans pay for their extra government that the Democrats want to bring into the United States with a value-added tax, a sales tax applied at each stage in production. The value added tax on average in Europe provides about 20% of government revenue. So you have that element of fiction and unrealism on the left saying we want this level of government and we're going to tax the rich and corporations to get it, when that won't get you there. You have an equal sense of unreality on the right, who say we don't want to increase taxes at all. Well, if that's your case, then you're going to have to figure out a way to reduce expenditures. And you can't ignore reducing expenditures for those of us of a certain age, receiving our Social Security benefits and having our health care covered by Medicare. If you're going to balance or you don't have to balance the federal government. If you're willing to bring deficits under control, and I think the European standard of 3% of GDP is a reasonable place to aim as what becomes safe, what creates a sustainable fiscal fisc going forward. The Biden budgets have us at 4.6% on a chronic basis. Well, the Republicans don't have a proposal for getting us under 3% without increasing taxes. And the last Republican who cared about that sort of thing, Paul Ryan, is no longer around. So I wanted to bring a sense of reality to the discussion and, most importantly, try to move us past the fiction that we can get the government that the Democrats are proposing strictly by taxing the rich and corporations, that their path leads, I think, inexorably to a national value-added tax, which in the United States is more complicated because we already have filled up the sales tax with state and local government levies.
Yeah, that makes it more complex. And to me, what makes it even more risky is that we're doing these in economically prosperous years. I mean, usually you do a deficit spending when the market is declining, when there's a problem, because that helps move the economy as government starts to spend. But we did that in 2008, and we haven't really reduced our spending since then. It's been a constant increase that has happened from that year. During the Clinton administration, it's not lost on me, there was somewhat of a grand compromise where they did both. Now, to be fair, they did the tax increase during a period of time when they had a Democratic Congress, and they did the tax cuts under the Clinton administration during the time that they had a Republican Congress. But nonetheless, it left him in a position where they came up with a balanced budget. What I'm wondering is whether or not, if you were to propose a VAT tax, first, what the economic implications are of that. When Elliot comes back on, maybe we can have more discussion around that. But what you're really doing there is you're taxing consumption as opposed to taxing income, taxing making money. Thoughts on that, Bob?
Yeah, so one of the things that I suggested in the column is that economic conservatives shouldn't dismiss out of hand the idea of taxing consumption, certainly in lieu of all the tax increases that would have a serious deleterious effect on investment capital. I mean, you would be removing hundreds of billions of dollars from the private sector economy. The Biden budget staff says that will have zero effect on economic growth in the private sector. But I think that's not understanding the role. The real question is, where do you want to get spending at a position where you can sustain it over time? Prior to COVID, the federal government was spending 21% of gross national product. That actually increased during COVID with all the emergency spending to 30% of GDP. Well, Biden proposes not to return it to its pre-COVID level, or even a little above that to account for more of us enrolling in Social Security and Medicare, but to level it off at 24% of GDP, substantially above what it was pre-COVID, and continue that level in perpetuity. If the Republicans want to not do that, and if you don't either avoid a value-added tax or make it as in lieu of some of the taxes that we have on income and capital, they need to figure out a realistic proposal to either return to the pre-COVID level, or I think slightly above it, maybe 22% of GDP. But I think what kind of federal government we want is the first policy decision. And I think that the consequences of a value-added tax, in terms of what it would do to prices, is going to be substantial. That's not a good alternative as an add-on to what we currently have. It might be useful as a substitute for some of what we have, but if we need to say, what's the level of, what kind of federal government do we want? What's the level of spending that is associated with? And then what tax structure can sustain that over time, running deficits that markets are willing to finance at a reasonable rate?
And it's not, I think, lost on many people. We had a conversation in our last topic about this with Biden trying to tax not only unearned gains, but the huge tax on that he's talking about on capital gains. Last time that was attempted was in 1986. Actually, they were successful in it, but what it ended up creating was a savings and loan crisis that came during the Bush administration because of people who began to move away from investments, and that left those investments deflating in value. And as those assets deflated in values, they were handed back to the lenders, and then all of a sudden the lenders had an issue. To me, the taxes that are being proposed by Biden, I'm not really worried about them being implemented because I can't imagine even a Democratic Congress would really pass them. But saying that, they're the type of taxes that would create an apocalyptic version inside the economy. I agree with you. You have to start with what's the size of the federal government that you want, and you have to be willing to make hard choices. And I haven't seen either side being willing to do that. That has to be offset with, how do you at least begin to ensure that if you're going to continue this type of spending, that you have some type of revenue that offsets it. Professor, any thoughts on this subject? I'll give you the last point on this one as we come to the end of the hour.
I think that the constituency for small government and low taxes is kind of evaporated as the Republican Party has moved away from its traditional fiscal conservative free market ideology towards more populist nationalist ideology. And anyone worried about the size of government and taxes, that's got to be a worrying development, because without that strong, as you said, Paul Ryan, Bob, was the last person who pushed for this. He's really kind of a pre-Trump politician and being eliminated in the Trump era. Without those sorts of people pushing really hard to constrain federal spending and to think hard about taxes, it's hard to see anyone pushing in a more free market perspective on this as the Republican Party moves away from those goals. Now, of course, what could happen, and this is what I think has happened in the past when we saw the big neoliberal reforms in the 80s, is that government expands and expands, and then eventually it comes to some sort of a crisis point where a massive deregulatory movement, lower taxes, free market movement has to come in and clean house. But of course, the question is, do we really have to go through that? Do things have to get so bad before the political system opens its eyes to the problem? I really hope that we don't. But given the trajectory of politics now, it could be that we do.
All right, so I'm going to go around my comment of giving you the last comment on this because I want to ask Bob one more question on it. I was really hoping during this presidential year that we actually would see a third-party candidate who would espouse these ideas of lower government, less government spending, and a focus on a strong defense and recognizing the importance of supporting our allies. That's not what we got. We may have a third-party candidate, but I'm not sure that Robert Kennedy is going to be anywhere close to those types of concepts. Is there an opportunity or a chance for a third party on these ideas as the budget begins to suffer, or an evolution of either of the other two parties that begin to adopt it more? Because again, I do think this is the single greatest threat that we exist in internally, which is our own budget deficit. Or is this an idea that just simply is going to continue to be an outlier?
I fear it will continue to be an outlier until, as Henry indicated, it results in some kind of serious event that the politicians cannot ignore. However, you do have the Ross Perot example in the early 1990s, when the state of the federal government's finances were far better than they are today. And the difference in direction between the two parties with respect to fiscal policy wasn't nearly as sharp as it is today. And if he had, and he gained some traction, and his major issue was fixing the finances of the federal government. I do think that there was a small sliver of hope in how well Nikki Haley continued to do in Republican primaries after she had left the race. She continued to get 15 to 20% of the Republican primary vote. That suggests that the sort of traditional conservative point of view, which shares all the things that you described, Paul, isn't entirely dead in the Republican Party, and probably is the swing vote that will decide the outcome of the rematch between Biden and Trump. Being not dead in the Republican Party is a long way from being a viable alternative as a third party or a recovery of the Republican Party. But we do have the Perot example, and we do have the sustained support that Nikki Haley maintained to suggest that maybe we won't have to wait till catastrophe hits before our political class responds appropriately.
So why do you think it is that, I go back to that Perot election, and George Bush and Bill Clinton were both running in it. Right before Bill Clinton, we had in the Democratic primary Paul Tsongas, who was also talking about balanced budget issues. Again, you can look at that race and you can see Ross Perot had a huge effect. He definitely moved Bill Clinton, when he won, towards being more accountable on the budget deficit. He understood that there was a constituency for that in the center that was strong, and so he was trying to appeal to that center. And he did that during his race. You may remember the Soldier Sister moment. Same thing, a constant appeal to try to get those independents in the center. I'm watching these two guys run today, and regardless of what they're both saying, they're both working really hard to get their extreme bases, as opposed to trying to pick up the people in the center. Why is that? What has changed in our politics that has caused that to take place?
I think you've had an ideological evolution in both political parties. So Bill Clinton, the New Democrat, after the rebuke in 1994 in the congressional races, he became a let's expand government by small measures, small ball liberal. And George Bush the first was a Northeastern standard issue Republican who kind of made peace with the Reagan Revolution, but wasn't really a part of it. So now the Democratic Party, Elizabeth Warren defines the center of gravity in the Democratic Party. Bill Clinton didn't want to transform the American political economy into a European-style social democracy. That is what the Democratic Party now stands for. And Joe Biden's always been a weather vane. Wherever the center of gravity was in the Democratic Party, that's where he was, and that was his case throughout his
Mm-hmm.
political career, but I believe that they are ideologically there. As Henry described, the Republican Party is now more of a populist, nationalist, even personality cult with respect to Donald Trump. And the traditional conservative point of view is a minority. And as I said, I'm encouraged by how Nikki Haley did, but she still got stomped in the final analysis. So you've had both political parties evolve in ways that lead an awful lot of what was the center left and the center right, going back to the 1990s, and I think today, politically homeless. These two political parties simply don't address them, and they do want to turn everything into a base turnout competition, which is interesting because I do believe the Nikki Haley Republicans is the swing group that's going to decide this election. Biden says that he wants to invite them into supporting his campaign, but everything he does and says is part of the problem from their point of view. So he unlike Bill Clinton, he's not triangulating to try to appeal to those people and to obtain their votes. He's just, I guess, assuming that Trump is repulsive enough to them that he doesn't have to do anything else. I don't think that's good politics for him, and it's certainly not good policy for the country.
No, and it's a big risk, because if Donald Trump decided to make Nikki Haley his VP, assuming she would go along with it, he would win this race. There's no doubt in my mind. People would be willing to suffer through Trump for the chance of being able to get a Nikki Haley back into politics and try to recenter the Republican Party. Now, my guess is Biden's bet is that Donald Trump's ego is way too big to agree to have anyone on his team that doesn't completely take a bended knee to Donald Trump, and that probably is a good bet. But I want to try to get to an optimistic message and in with this. Henry, you're raising young Henry. You've come from New Zealand into our country. You're watching this from a college campus standpoint with lots of young people going through it. You know, Bob and I both talked about, we think we're turning the corner on wokeism, but your point was early on that you're not even sure that it's as prevalent inside the college campuses maybe as we might think. Give us the hopeful message for young Henry being raised in the United States. What are your thoughts on that? We'll end with this.
I don't think there's any better place to be born on the face of the earth than the United States of America in 2024. I don't think there has been a better place to be born on the face of the earth than the United States of America pretty much since the late 18th century. Maybe certain places like Australia and New Zealand could compete for a while in the 19th century and through the late 20th century, but in my view, even the kind of blessed places where I'm from, like Australia and New Zealand, that were very similar to the US, are falling behind for various reasons that we haven't talked about on the show, but maybe we will in the future. And this country's still got a hell of a lot going for it, especially when you look at the rest of the developed world, where they've got all sorts of problems, economic and social problems that we've talked about at length as well. So we have high standards for ourselves in America. I think it's good. But at the same time, looking outside the country, making that real comparison that, immigrants like me make every day, it really is a pretty simple calculation for wanting to live in America, even for your kids to go to a big public university like ASU, get a great education here, world-class education, a relatively low cost, with almost no disruption, I would say, from these sorts of protests. So that's my basic case for the United States, and I guess I'm living testament to it.
Yeah, we are definitely a much greater country than our politics is living up to today. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being on the show, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. We appreciate you being here on the New Frontiers.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.